or just do ping pong.
Yeah, so, alright. So we're going to start into the kingdom's division here. We have gone through a lot of the heirs of the Old Testament, wrapping up the united monarchy with Solomon and his reign. And looking forward here, we're going to show how the kingdom divides in half. Next week is off because of the Super Bowl, unless we get a majority of students who clamor to have Foundations for Faith instead of the Super Bowl because of the teams playing in it this year. I will entertain appeals for class if people want. But typically we take Super Bowl off because it's nearly an American holiday.
I mean, if it were any other teams.
Any other teams, I know.
But
Yeah, boycott the Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes and the Eagles are in it. No.
You start it up on the group chat and give me a consensus in favor and I'll have class. Otherwise, we'll come back in 2 weeks and talk about Jeroboam and Baasha and their kingly lines in the northern kingdom and what happens in the south. So, one thing I did realize we need to wrap up though is the literature of Solomon. He wrote several books of the Old Testament. We're going to look at the book of Proverbs here first. So this one was written by Solomon, King Lemuel, and Agur. And some people think Agur and Lemuel may just be alternative names for Solomon, but they're mysterious characters that don't come up with any other references or mentions in the scriptures.
some of his.
And King Lemuel doesn't even have a kingdom assigned to him, and so what he was the king of is mysterious.
Some of
But
Solomon's monarchical buddies.
perhaps. But anyway, the book of Proverbs gets compiled during Hezekiah's reign.
How do we know?
It actually talks about it in Proverbs chapter 25 or 6. It makes a reference to the Proverbs that were compiled by Hezekiah's men. So it is written right into the book. And it is broken up to different parts. It is not the same thing all the way through. Chapters 1 through 9 are kind of essays on the importance of wisdom, but they take the form of a letter written to his son, Rehoboam, who is going to take the throne after him. And then Proverbs 10 through 29, those chapters are mostly single verse proverbs, although there are a few that stretch out over a few verses. But that make an observation or a comparison between two opposites and a whole bunch of short pithy sayings.
A lot of synthetical and antithetical.
Yep, a lot of them are synonymous and some of the rest are antithetical, parallelism. Proverbs 30 are the sayings of Agur, and Proverbs 31 is the famous chapter about the noble woman or a noble wife,
Oh, that's
Yes.
31.
wrapped into the sayings of King Lemuel.
Does the writing style change at all in 30 and 31, or does it really just sound like a pen name?
No, actually, it's a different style, and so it could very noticeably be
a
different.
person.
But there's a lot of proverbs that were attributed to Solomon that are not extant and found in the Bible, and so this could just be he had different formats and
Yeah.
such, and so that's just a point of dispute that nobody can iron out because we don't have any extra biblical or biblical sources that can give us any more information on Agur and King Lemuel. But it does give us two additional potential authors of the Bible. So, next book of poetry written by Solomon is Ecclesiastes. And in the context of what he writes in the book, you can see that he wrote this near the end of his reign and the end of his life, because he's very reflective on different seasons in his life. I highly suggest that you read this book in one sitting, because a single chapter and wait a week and then read another chapter is a really hard way to get through and make sense of it, because he opens with ideas and the conclusion of the matter, which of course is the memory verse this week and next week, are the key parts. And
Yeah, if you do it a little bit at a time, it's going to come across as very depressing.
yep, I had a friend once who watched the play Our Town, which is a very depressing play, like production, and if there's ever a depressing play that I've ever seen, Our Town ranks right up there. And as we were walking out from that, he's like, man, I feel so good about myself, I think I'm just going to go read the book of Ecclesiastes to cheer myself up. So in this book, Solomon talks about how he pursues wisdom, pleasure, work, advancement, riches, and he clearly did that during his reign, but he finds all of them are meaningless in and of themselves. And then he reflects on how death is inevitable. It is something that the wise and the foolish both find. Those who work and those who are lazy both find it. Those who are rich and those who are poor both die. And was trying to figure out what is the meaning of all this. One of the other themes that comes across in the book of Ecclesiastes is just simply acknowledging the limits of human understanding, which is a very important theme for us to remember in this day and age, because we have piles and piles of knowledge, and all kinds of people think they have wisdom and understanding, but we don't often recognize our limits and the edges of what we actually know. And one of the key themes and conclusions of the book is that it is good to find contentment with your present circumstances, whatever they may be. And Solomon gives a whole range of options. So there's another one of the themes of the book of Ecclesiastes.
So is it like a depressing autobiography, sort of?
It's not autobiographical as much as it is philosophical,
Right.
and it is
'Cause-
depressing in that he tries this and he finds no joy in it.
Yeah,
He tries
he's
this
not
and he finds no
He's
joy.
not
Like-
like writing his whole life story. He's just like talking about how he pursued wisdom,
Right.
pleasure, work, advancement, riches. He's not actually writing his whole life story.
Yeah.
It's depressing because he does all them at such a scale that's impossible for us to do. It's like if Solomon did this and pursued, wisdom which was granted to him by God,
Mhm.
and he just pursues this, like makes it the goal of his life, and it doesn't give him pleasure and it's just meaningless to him, how then can I do this? And it's like
Yeah.
that for every single one of them.
Yeah.
It's definitely a good exhortation to not devote your life to either wisdom, pleasure, work, toil, riches, or advancements, because Solomon found all of them to be wanting. And very few of us have the opportunity to really delve into any one of those.
Yeah.
And Solomon hit all 5 of them in great measure and
Still.
hit the limits of human possibility, and still found there's just nothing here.
I wonder if Putin would agree with that.
Yeah, I don't know. Be curious to know his thoughts on that for sure.
Yeah.
Moving on, the conclusion of Ecclesiastes. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. That is the strongest take-home message out of the book of Ecclesiastes. Moving on to the book of Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon. This is a unique book in the Old Testament, and it is written as a love song, a kind of call and response type thing between the lover and the beloved, and then there's the chorus of friends in the background every now and again. And so this could actually have been a performance piece, which is interesting to think of how it may have been rendered as a performance piece, but it is different in the sense that it explores human love and desire in a very strong, very expressive, vibrant, and graphically image way. And so my dad always said he had heard of a tradition where the Hebrew men didn't let their sons read this until they were of a certain age, actually, which would not surprise me. There's a lot of things that mean a lot more to the Hebrew ear than we'll pull out in English, honestly. But there's a lot of interesting themes in here, and a lot of human relationship that is drawn out. One of the things that is drawn out is that there is the deep sense of longing for the person you love when you're separated from them. And as a single, you may not experience that or know that, but that is something that you can feel once you are united in marriage with another person. And then there's also just a lot of things, using nature as symbols for love in the course of the book. Is always comparing his beloved to various different things in nature, and it goes back and forth, and then so you have all this imagery talking about their relationship. A lot of people preach the book as an allegory of God's love for his people, which is very true. I don't believe that's really how Solomon wrote it, honestly, but it is a good illustration, because you have in the New Testament where the church is referred to as the bride of Christ, in which case this book offers up a very interesting perspective on Christ's relationship to the church and how close Jesus the Messiah feels to the church and his feelings in regard to the church. But there is honestly an awful lot of physicality and intimacy in the book, and it gets quite explicit quite quick.
I stumbled upon that book in my little kid's Bible when I was 7, and I was shocked.
Yeah. So, any questions on the Song of Solomon?
No, we read it like last month.
A while ago, you're right. We did. All right. Jumping forward here. Let's divide the kingdom. So, we're going to look at this in a fair amount of depth here tonight, because there's a lot of questions that most people have about why did the kingdom divide, and we're going to look at them here pretty thoroughly. So the context of the kingdom dividing is Solomon's reign coming to an end. And while Solomon was known as the wisest of all kings, he was not wholeheartedly following God like his father David did. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. It says, "Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant, my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son." And this is because Solomon was enticed into worshiping false gods by some of his many wives. Remember, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and they came from many foreign countries and worshipped false gods. And he accommodated their pagan worship in Jerusalem and was enticed into worshiping their pagan gods with them. And it is probably something he repented from at the very end of his life. If you look at Ecclesiastes, it kind of implies that, but it was definitely something God faulted him for towards the end of his reign. So God spoke this division into existence here during Solomon's reign before he dies. As it continues in the next verse, it says, "However, I will not tear away all of the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen." And we're going to track with that idea of one tribe because it's a little fluid as it moves on through. So there's another character during Solomon's reign towards the latter part that becomes a major character. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Describes him as being very able and industrious, and he gets placed in charge of the forced labor from the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim is one of the large tribes out of Joseph, and they are parked just north of Benjamin and Judah, very prominently centrally located tribe in Israel. And the forced labor coming from Ephraim would be a very sizable chunk of the forced labor. Remember, Solomon was doing all kinds of building expeditions and projects and construction of this, that, and the other thing in his reign. And the people of Israel were not really used to that because they had lived nomadically for about 400 years. Even though they had cities and villages, they were living in tents. It appears from the scriptures and also from the archaeological record. They were not really that well settled down. They were pastoral and mobile. So, prophet Ahijah comes to Jeroboam, and this is recorded in 1 Kings 11, 29 through 40. And Ahijah prophesies that 10 tribes are going to be given to Jeroboam the son of Nebat to rule after Solomon's death. And Solomon gets word of this and drives Jeroboam the son of Nebat out because that's a threat to the throne. And so Jeroboam heads down to Egypt. And then we have Solomon actually dying, and then they're like, well, we got to put his son on the throne. So they get Rehoboam. The rest of Israel had an idea that they wanted a lighter tax burden and a lighter labor burden. The forced labor is something that we're not used to in the United States. If the United States is going to build something, they don't conscript labor from the locals to build it. They just simply tax the locals and then pay a contractor to do the labor.
The French did it.
Yeah. Over in Kenya, actually, that was the way they did roads. A couple days a month, the local chief had the authority to conscript labor, and everybody was supposed to show up and turn out with their own tools to do road construction. And if they didn't, they could be fined and jailed and whatever else. That was how they did stuff in Kenya just back in 2008 when I was last there.
I feel like that incentivizes good roads then, because like everyone's gonna be working hard to get to drive on the thing for the next 30 days or a couple of years.
Yeah, but at the same time, nobody's an expert or a specialist, and nobody has any heavy equipment, and you're not paving it, you're just smoothing out the ruts and getting the big rocks out of the way. And yeah, they were horrible roads, they were terrible. So the people say to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy, using the imagery of an ox that has been yoked up to a plow. And he says, now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. And he said to them, go away for 3 days and come back to me, because he wanted to consult. So he talks with his father's advisors, and Solomon's advisors say, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever.
That's literally the perfect response.
It was the perfect response, and he rejected the perfect response because the hand of God had something else in mind. And he hears from his friends who grew up with him in the palace, and they said, thus you shall speak to this people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs, and now whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.
Where did that come from?
The foolishness of youth. Yep.
That's crazy.
It was utterly foolish, and everybody in Israel said, to your tents. They didn't want to have anything to do with that, and so then they set Jeroboam up as the king.
Even after all that labor, they were all still intense.
Yep. They were building all kinds of fortifications and temples and
Surrounded with
gatehouses,
big walls.
but they lived in tents surrounded by walls. Yep. So it says the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So it's an interesting thing in the course of human affairs that you have like the moment of decision where it's some stupid idiocy or foolishness that triggers literally large events. But behind it you have the hand of God who's already spoken it into existence and decreed when it's going to take place, and how he executes it is just to be determined. And this is very much the way this plays out. And the prophets said it beforehand, they said it in the middle of it, and we actually see that here coming up shortly. In verse 16 it says, when all Israel saw the king did not listen to them, the people answered to the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance of the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, David. And so Israel went to their tents. And then make Jeroboam king in the north. It says, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. And there was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. And then it starts getting a little more complicated. It's amended in the very next verse, actually. Because when 11 tribes rebel against you, what do you do as king?
You'll levy an army.
You'll levy an army and try to subjugate them all again. So when Rehoboam comes back to Jerusalem, he assembles all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. See, Jerusalem was a city that was right on the border between Judah and Benjamin, and so Benjamin being in that close a proximity to Jerusalem was very easy to influence.
180,000 Benjamites that are chosen warriors. They have restored their numbers since getting almost wiped out in the Judges.
Yep.
All of the above.
I
not
think
just
that's of
Benjamin.
Judah and Benjamin,
Oh.
but
And we'll technically Simeon too,
we'll get to there. 2 slides.
but, oh, okay.
Anyway, so they go up to fight and try to restore the whole kingdom to Rehoboam. And then in the middle of the battlefield comes this prophet, and I kind of envision one of those Gandalf type figures walking out in between the armies. It says, the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Shemaiah was a prophet from this era, and he actually wrote a few books, but they're no longer extant. If you ever come across them in the Middle East someday, I want to read them. But he said, go say to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives, the people of Israel. Every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. So they listened to the word of the Lord, and they went home according to the word of the Lord.
Definitely a Gandalf figure.
Yep. All right, now if you dig out a map of the tribal inheritances, this all makes a little bit more sense here. So you have Judah in the south, and like I pointed out earlier, Jerusalem is right on the border between Benjamin and Judah, so Benjamin quickly and easily gets assumed into the kingdom of Judah because they're right next to Jerusalem. Now Simeon was granted an inheritance down in the southern part of Judah, and they are never referenced ever again, like at all in the entire Bible, I'm pretty
yeah, I
sure.
was just thinking about why do we never hear about them?
Yeah, because of the blessing / curse that Jacob spoke to his sons Levi and Simeon. He said,
Yeah, 'cause didn't they destroy that
you
one
shall be,
city?
yep, they opposed their father and they killed a whole bunch of innocent men in cold blood. And then Jacob said, you will be dispersed in Israel, and essentially they were going to lose their tribal identity. And that took 2 different forms. With Levi, they became the Levitical priesthood, or the Levitical priestly tribe, and so they didn't have a specific inheritance of territory. They were just given towns and cities all throughout, and so they were dispersed and distributed until this day, actually. Simeon just gets absorbed into Judah, so far as we can tell. Geographically, it's impossible for them to have been part of the northern kingdom because they were to the south of Judah, but we don't really hear about them having a tribal identity independent of Judah from this point forward, or actually from a few hundred years earlier and forward. Everything on the other side of the Jordan River joined in with the north. Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh were over there, but they were part of the northern kingdom.
Yeah, they do, Simeon is mentioned in Revelation, isn't he?
Yes, Simeon
That's
is,
the next, the
that's
last.
the next
next time you hear
reference
about it is in Revelation.
in Revelation, yeah. All right, so one other thing, and I think this will come out next time we gather and talk about the reign of Jeroboam, is the Levites that were distributed around in the north found themselves to be an oppressed people, and most of them, if not all of them, ended up fleeing from the northern kingdom and moved wholesale down into Judah. And over the next several weeks as we go through this divided kingdom period, you're going to realize that you have a lot of northerners who end up moving down into Judah, and the tribal identities don't stick as well because you have people who decide they're going to follow God in Judah instead of worship false gods up in the northern kingdom of Israel. And so there's a lot of back and forth flow as people sorted out their religious allegiances.
And so your geographic location was less connected to your tribal identity.
Yep, going forward, your tribal identity and your geographic location were more likely to be disconnected.
But then I suppose it also means genetically you're going to be mixing a little bit more.
Yep.
And so you're going to have less. Yeah.
Did people still talk about the tribal identity in the day of Jesus?
Yeah, when Jesus went to the temple as an infant, somebody from the tribe of Asher is in the temple and speaks about him. The woman who's from the tribe of Asher. Now, that's like one of the few references to the tribe of Asher that you ever get in the entire Bible, but there's one right there, and that's in the New Testament. And
Are there many others?
Paul is referred to as descended from the tribe of Benjamin, and there's a few other people that are connected to tribes. So they did still keep that to some extent, but not as much. So, all right, we're going to introduce something with a few minutes that we have left here, because today was supposed to be the second literature. We already talked about parallelism, and we've already quizzed it twice. Going to point out a distinction here, though. This verse here in Proverbs 4:9, you have parallelism that is in the same order. She will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. The she here is wisdom, actually, and sometimes people prefer to translate it as it, but wisdom will place, or wisdom will bestow, is idea A in both lines, and idea B is the graceful garland or a beautiful crown. There is a different way of arranging this, which is known as a chiasmus. And you can have synonymous parallelism or antithetical parallelism that goes idea A, idea B, and then idea B, idea A. And this is where you reverse the order of the second line. So here in Proverbs 4 verse 8, just the verse before it, it says, "Prize her highly and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her." And so this reverses the order of a synonymous idea. So just like in English poetry, you have A-B rhyming schemes, and you have A-B rhyming schemes and things of the sort. Sometimes you'll have an A-B-C rhyming scheme. The Jews will do it in a very similar way. And you can do it in antithetical as well. Psalm 1:6, "The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." So idea A is the Lord knows, which usually implies that it will lead to life. The way of the righteous, and you have the way of the wicked will perish. In this case, you have B prime and A prime. So this is a chiasmus at a small scale. Now we're going to look at this at a larger scale. And they are all through the Old Testament. And this is a fascinatingly powerful way to demonstrate that an author wrote a story and no one else edited it, because a chiasmus will get destroyed if an unknowing author tries to tamper with the darn thing. So this comes out of Daniel chapter 1. Idea 1, you start with Babylon assumes supremacy over Israel, and you have young men that end up getting subjected to pagan training. Daniel seeks to remain faithful to God. And then the key point in the center of this is the test, where they go 10 days eating vegetables and water. That would be the center pivot point in this chiasmus.
Where did we talk about this recently?
Youth group,
Oh,
a couple weeks ago.
okay.
Resolving conflict,
Oh,
negotiating a solution.
I was gonna say, it's
Yep.
very familiar.
And then going back down on the other side of the chiasmus, you have Daniel succeeding in remaining faithful to God. You have the young men triumph in their pagan training, and then you have an Israelite supreme over Babylon, because Daniel gets appointed to be like chief of all the advisors in Babylon.
Which is basically the number 2 guy.
Yeah, he's like a prime minister type person.
He was really young at that point. too.
And he was crazy young. Yeah.
So the orders are completely opposite. So it starts with Babylon supremacy, ends with Israelite supremacy. In the middle is young men are trained pagan, and then they triumph over it in the middle of the end, and then the peak. And then like in the middle, like the middle and peak is Daniel seeking and successfully staying faithful to God.
Yeah.
So it's like a huge mirror kind of.
It's a mirror. Yeah, the
Yeah.
stories do this, and they do this regularly.
It's like a mountain.
It's like a
So-
mountain.
It's like
Yes.
a secret code to tell us that it was one author.
Uh-huh. So it happens again in Daniel chapter 6. We're all familiar with this. This is when Daniel ends up in the lion's den. So it starts off with an introduction how Daniel has been successful. Then Darius signs a decree. Daniel takes a stand and prays anyway. Then point C, you have Daniel's opponents seeking to orchestrate his demise. Darius hopes for Daniel's deliverance from the lions. And then the pivot point in this story, I believe, is that God remembers Daniel in the lion's den. Close their mouths. So Darius comes back the next morning. He witnesses Daniel's deliverance from the lions. Then all of a sudden, Daniel's opponents meet an unexpected demise. Then Darius signs another decree, and he takes a stand. And then, in the end, Daniel is once again successful in all he's doing.
So would this one be synonymous then?
This is a larger narrative. We're not looking for a synonymous
Oh,
or
okay.
antithetical in this. This is a chiastic structure, and it's a way that the Jews or the Hebrews would structure a story. So it builds up to a point, and then it builds down from a point.
But
So
they mirror each other.
then
Okay,
they
yeah.
mirror.
So it's not
Mhm.
same or different, it's mirror.
Yeah, it's a mirrored structure to
Yeah.
the story.
But Daniel 1's mirror was kind of opposite in a sense.
Yep, oftentimes things will go in reverse.
Okay,
So, but there will be an idea that relates to itself.
okay.
So, one of the grandest examples of this, you're right, it hasn't shown up outside yet, has it?
I don't believe so.
Almost done. This is a fun one.
Alright.
So, the flood account is another chiastic account,
Oh my gosh.
and this one is a really long one.
Mm-hmm.
So, you start off with a transitional introduction of Noah and his sons. You have the corruption of all flesh. God resolves to destroy the earth by a flood. God's command and Noah's response, and then he enters into the ark. You have the beginning of the flood, inundating of the earth. You have the rising of the waters, and then the pivot in this story that has no parallel on the downside is God remembers Noah. And this is Genesis 8:1, which I think was a memory verse.
That's the peak.
That is the peak.
So there's
And then we start going down. You have the waters receding, you have the end of the flood and the drying of the earth, you have God's command and Noah's response, leave the ark, not enter the ark. God resolves never again to destroy the earth by a flood, and you have a covenant with all flesh, and then you have talking about Noah and his sons once again. And so the flood story, sometimes people will critique the way it's structured and it's repetitive and it's circling around, but there's really this grand structure that was woven right into it. And this is actually a simplified version of the chiasmus. You could add in several more parallel elements
Mhm.
with the 40 days, with the 7 days, like just over and over and over again.
Oh yeah, because they waited in the ark 7 days
Yep.
before it began, and then before they could leave, right?
Yep. So you have 7 days twice at the beginning, 40 days, and then there's 150 days. God remembers Noah. You have a reference to the same 150 days, then another 40 days, and then 2 more 7 days. You can add right into the middle of all that.
So that's how you can kind of prove it did happen in that time period, because it was only there's no way multiple authors could have came up with that, so it'd have to be one author, and there's no way that one author would have lived for like a huge
Mhm.
3 million year period of the earth being flooded.
Right,
So
for sure.
that proves that
There's
it
a lot of-
actually happened.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are significant in this. There's a lot of revisionist literary analysis of the Old Testament that tries to point out that there's actually 4 primary schools of authors. You have like the Torahist, and then you have the Deuteronomists, and then there's a few other people that they think were working on it, and they will actually take this story and dissect it down and be like, this verse was written by this person, this verse was written by another person. But the chiastic structure of the story obliterates anything to that, because you could not
Right.
sustain a chiasmus in the middle of it.
Yeah, how can people from like just different areas and different
Mhm.
time periods just somehow create a chiastic
Yeah,
poem in
It's
it? That
conspiracy.
doesn't happen. And
Mhm.
like maybe it happens as an accident once, but like no, there's no way it can happen with chiastic poems being filled in the Bible. That just disproves that it was an accident or
Yeah.
mere chance.
Yeah, it's a literary structure, and you learn about similar things in English composition.
Right.
Like with any story, you've got your introduction, and you got your building suspense, and then there's a climax and a really quick resolution.
Right.
And that's like the traditional English literature story. And the Jews did it very differently. The climax is smack in the middle, and then you have things that parallel everything that was building on the way.
That's kind of
So
cool. That's kind of cool.
it is
Helps
really
you
cool.
Remember it better because it's like if
Mhm.
everything mirrors, it's like half the things.
It's actually one of those things that points towards the oral telling and tradition, because
Right.
you have mirrored ideas, then you can remember those points on the way up, and then you reflect them on the way back down. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That does make sense actually.
so your extra credit homework, if you so choose, is to find another chiastic story in the Old Testament, or at a minimum, a verse in the poetry that has a chiastic
Sure,
structure.
are we thinking like what a
I have a couple of Ghirardelli bars,
The big one.
the big
Full-size
ones.
bars.
Yep. So, we're talking a serious quantity of chocolate.
can I
Question.
Yep, go ahead and kill it.
We will have a violin